Hi everyone, this is Mila again, and in today's lecture we're going to be discussing a very important topic, and today you'll basically learn everything that you're going to need to complete your final project. We're going to be talking about research, and in the first half of the video I'll go over some of the concepts that some of you may probably be already familiar with. But I just wanted to make it a little bit more interesting and supply it with a few examples of research work that I do. As you know from my intro video, I work for Cision, and this is a company that does public relations and media research, and we work with companies, most major corporations that you might have heard of. Be that Toyota, be that Ford, be that most of the automotive companies that are in the market right now. We also work with non-government organizations such as Amnesty International. This is specifically my client. We work with hotel chains. So basically any company that you could think of, there is a good chance that they're our client. And so I'll walk you through some of the examples of the research that I do for Amnesty International, and I'll explain you the concepts that you've seen in your textbook, in this textbook, or maybe other textbooks on public relations research. And in the second half of the video, I will talk about the differences between public relations research domestically and public relations research internationally. There are a few major differences that there will be, and I'm going to teach you to analyze things on the international market to make your campaigns more successful. Okay, so why do all these major large corporations pay to Cision and other research companies to basically do their research for them? There are a number of reasons. One of them is the data-driven decision making. It's way easier to make the right decision when you know there's a good probability that this is going to be the right one compared to the wrong decision, right? And you actually know what the probability of success is. Another thing is the credibility factor. Our bosses or the top management, they all like hard numbers, and public relations is not really doesn't involve that much math or statistics per se, but we've made a great progress lately, and we learned to quantify things that matter, and that way we look more credible in the eyes of the top management, right? Another reason is the goal definition, because sometimes we don't really know where to move or what to begin with, and research helps us to dig into a problem deeper and define what are the goals and the objectives of public relations campaign or public relations program should be. And finally, there's continuous improvement. You know, public relations is a cycle. We do research, we execute our campaign, we analyze and evaluate it, and then we take the best from our previous campaigns, all the things that worked, and leave behind the things that didn't work, and implement or plan a new campaign with that knowledge. So this is a cycle, and the reason, one of the most important reasons why we want to do research is to get better each time we implement a new campaign or a new public relations program. Now let's go through the example of Amnesty International. They came to me after there was a leadership change, and apparently their new leadership wanted to know what's going on with their communication strategy, and they wanted to know what kind of public relations activities would best contribute to their organizational goals. As you know, Amnesty International does work related to human rights, and their most important things that they cared about is having people signing petitions. They are mobilizing protesters when there is a certain issue in society, and they lobby the Washington officials on issues like gun violence, immigration, climate change, and many others. So they knew that their most important audiences were Generation Z, which is people 18 to 24 years old. They knew that the Latina communities were another important audience. people who care about the gun reform, as well as the Washington officials. And they wanted to know what would be the best way to target those audiences. Your textbook identify 4 types of research by purpose, and that includes formative research, monitoring, environmental scanning, and evaluative research. Formative research is the kind of research that we use when before our campaign even begins. We gather the data on our audiences, we gather the data on our stakeholders, trying to create messages and see if they will be working, potentially, right? So this is the kind of research that we do before the campaign begins. Then there's monitoring. Monitoring is used in the process of the campaign. So we're basically tracking how we're doing, if things are going well, if things are not going well, is there things that we can adjust for them to go smoother, and things like that. That might also include environmental scanning. And the major difference between monitoring and environmental scanning is if in monitoring we are tracking what we are doing, how these things are performing. Environmental scanning is we're looking at everything outside of whatever our organization is doing. Like what kind of laws are being discussed or passed by Congress, what our competitors are doing, what kind of social issues arising, such as, I don't know, this spring there were a lot of protests around the countries, and they actually had impact on the organizations as well. And so why do we want to do environmental scanning? That helps us to foresee potential problems and opportunities, knowing that this is an issue, such as, for example, when there were protests about George Floyd's death, Aunt Jemima brand decided to, the Quaker Oats decided to get rid of the brand Aunt Jemima, just to avoid that backlash that might happen or might not happen to them. They wanted to basically minimize the risks of getting negative publicity for that, and they decided to do it voluntarily. And finally, evaluative research. Evaluative research is used when we're done with our campaign and we want to know whether it worked, whether it didn't, was it a failure, was it a success, and why do we do it? Because we want to see what worked and what didn't, to be able to take those things that were really great for our campaign and use them, implement them in the next campaigns, and implement in our next public relations programs. Whereas things that didn't work, we just no longer be using them. So in case of Amnesty International, they wanted us to do a formative research. They wanted to know what would be the best ways to reach the audiences that they were most interested in. And we broke down their question into 3 questions. What are the media outlets that Amnesty International is already reaching? What are the media outlets that are used by each of the groups that they've identified? And what are the areas of improvement and opportunities for Amnesty International? So the first slide here, this is actually a real-world presentation. This is the real-world report. It answers the first question, what outlets write about Amnesty International the most? So you can see the top ones are the ones that published the most articles last year. And so we've identified where there's most interest towards the organization that is Amnesty International. This next slide shows you the breakdown by audiences and which media outlets they prefer to use, where they get their news from. As you can see, there's the bracket for Gen Z. There are policymakers, their favorite outlets, Latino community outlets. So that basically answers that second question. What are the outlets that are the most popular among our target audiences? Then your textbook identified identifies two types of research depending on where your data is coming from: primary research and secondary research. Primary research is the one that when we get our data directly from the source, whether we interview people, whether we survey them, whether we do content analysis on the newspapers. This is all primary research. If we're using the data that comes from some kind of other organization, the data was collected for a completely different purpose, unrelated to our cause. Nevertheless, there is data that maybe directly or not directly answers our questions, but we don't know how exactly it was collected. It wasn't collected by us or for us. Then we use secondary sources, secondary research. So in case of our case with Amnesty International, Cision is a media research organization. So for that first slide, we were using our own data, how many media hits Amnesty International had last year. We were using our own data sources, our own databases. Yet we don't conduct surveys, we don't do survey research. Therefore, we had to rely on data collected as far as I remember, it was Pew Research Center, and they were collecting it for some other reason. They are just mostly they were interested in public opinion and the popularity of different media outlets. Therefore, we don't really know how accurate this data is, how relevant this data is we don't really know it for sure because we weren't the ones collecting that data. So for our second slide, we were using Cision was using secondary data, and basically it was a mixed source research. Part of it was our proprietary data, and part of it was data obtained from publicly available sources. Public relations research can also be classified by methods it's using. Broadly, there are two types of methods, qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative methods include participant observation, they include focus groups, they include interviews, and sometimes content analysis. What do these all methods have in common? We don't quantify, we don't count anything. We basically describe what we're seeing, what is happening. So for example, if someone would ask me, hey Mila, what are the newspapers writing about, I don't know, Apple today? I would just read a few newspapers that mention Apple, and I would just describe the content. That wouldn't be any kind of quantitative content analysis. It would be just a qualitative content analysis because there's a pure description. Quantitative methods obviously are the ones when we use quantification, when we count something. These typically include surveys, these typically include experiments, and also content analysis. Make sure that you understand that content analysis can be both quantitative and qualitative. Not a lot of textbooks are talking about it, but if, for example, I'm asked how many times newspapers mentioned Apple in 2020, I would have to go over newspapers mentioning Apple and count those mentions. That would be quantitative content analysis. So here's the final slide of this formative research that we've done for Amnesty International. It basically answers the question what they should do in terms of their media relations to best reach their target audiences. The horizontal axis shows how many audience members each particular outlet reaches, and the vertical axis shows how many articles they have published about Amnesty International last year. So the closer an outlet to the upper right corner, the better. That means that the outlet already publishes a lot of Amnesty's content, and it reaches a lot of their target audience members. So our advice here in regards to these outlets, the Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, Politico, keep doing what you're doing, keep pitching those outlets. The outlets in the lower right corner represent an opportunity for Amnesty International. They have high reach among the target audiences, but they don't publish a lot of Amnesty-related content. So our advice here would be focus on improving relationships with these particular outlets, such as BuzzFeed, Bloomberg, Huffington Post, etc., etc. The outlets in the lower left corner, these are Boston Globe, Al Jazeera, AOL News, can be pretty much ignored. It would be okay if they don't invest much time or resources or money because they don't really write about Amnesty International a lot, but it doesn't really matter because they don't also reach a lot of target audience members. And finally, the outlets such as MSN, Reuters, Breitbart News, they already often pick up Amnesty International's content, but again, they aren't very popular among target audience members. So if they write about them, it's good. If they don't, again, not a big deal. So this is the report that we created for them, and based on that report, they created this document, which is their media strategy based on our analysis. Now, each public relations campaign has or should have a goal that closely aligns with organizational outcomes, be that increasing sales, be that mobilizing supporters, be that outperforming competitors and things like that. But how do we know that our public relations goal has been achieved or has not been achieved? What are the key performance indicators or KPI that we should be choosing? What are some of the things that we can measure as indicators of success of our public relations campaign? So first of all, and it's the most basic level, we can measure outputs. How many newspaper articles we got, what was the reach of those newspaper articles. And we can also measure impressions, mentions from social media. These things tap into awareness. How many people had a chance to see our content. The second thing that we can measure is outtakes, and these are the things like perceptions, attitudes, opinions. They typically are measured using surveys, polls, and what we are usually most interested in the attitude change. How many people have changed their attitude towards a certain issue, or how public attitudes towards an issue has changed over time. And the last thing, and this is the most important, and this is the most closely tied to organizational outcomes, it's the actual outcomes, depending on what the organizational goals are. It could be sales numbers, it could be subscriptions, it could be signing petitions. So basically, whatever we want the audience to do. So we measure behaviors. Now let me show you another report that I've created for Amnesty International. So based on the previous report that I've shown you, we defined a list of outlets that they should be focusing on, and now we're tracking their performance in these outlets quarter over quarter. So basically we measure volume, that is how many articles mentioned Amnesty International, the reach of the combined reach of these outlets. We are measuring key message penetration, target audience penetration for Amnesty International. Basically, we're tracking their performance over time. This is our monitoring research that we're doing. And I will include the full report for you to take a look at if you're interested in the files section down below. Know that we at Cision, our American office at Cision, work with Amnesty International USA, that is the US chapter of Amnesty International. But what if you're here in the United States and you're planning a public relations campaign abroad, outside of the US? in some of countries, I don't know, in Latin America, for example. Can be campaign exactly the same in all countries where you want to implement that campaign? Obviously not. There are some difficulties that you might face, not might, but probably will face as you go. First of all, language barriers. Obviously, you will need to translate all your campaign materials to the language of the country where you are planning to implement the campaign. Then there could be another issue, which is differences in meaning. For example, there was I think it was Italian brand, Bledina, who tried to sell their products in Russia, and they were selling baby formula. And no one wanted to buy their product because Bledina in Russian language means something like a prostitute, and no one would want to buy something like that for their kid. Another example comes from my research on corporate social responsibility, and I was comparing the meaning of corporate social responsibility across different countries, and it turns out that, for example, Chinese customers understand CSR more in terms of environmental responsibilities and voluntariness, like charity, community relations, and things like that. Whereas, for example, European and American customers think more about employee or stakeholder responsibility and about companies' responsibilities to make profits, to pay dividends to their shareholders, and things like that. And this is not surprising because most of the car manufacturers are actually located in the United States, in Western Europe. Therefore, these are their employers. These are the companies that people buy stocks from. Therefore, that is important here. So CSR can mean different things in different world regions. Then there's another problem, differences in culture. Think about the Middle East, for example, because women are so suppressed in these countries, in some of these countries, right? They can't show sometimes their faces. And look at this example from the IKEA catalog. They actually had to remove all females from their catalog. You can see here they're just a man and probably his son, and in the original catalog there was a mom in the picture, right? And finally, differences in technology. For example, differences in internet access. When you're planning a campaign that is, for example, a social media campaign, some countries don't have such a large social media penetration as we have it here in the United States. And actually, we will be talking a little bit about it in the Africa module. There's a guest speaker, Tolani Lukin. She will tell you about some of the challenges which she faced as a public relations practitioner in Africa. So, to sum up, you will have to do some kind of research on each of the countries that you are trying to target. And at the most basic level, you'll need to look at the following things. Things like political system, things like its economic environment or its economic development, the level of its economic development. Things like technological development, as I've mentioned. And there's also media system, its legal system, and as well as its culture. And in my next videos, I'm going to talk about how you can gather and analyze this kind of information. So stay tuned, and I will see you soon.